A scream of claws and fur shattered the morning fog. A wounded bobcat crashed through Rick Miller's window. Blood and wild fear tangled in the cab of his old truck. Any other man might have driven on, but Rick, haunted by loss and longing for purpose, threw himself into the chaos. What started as a desperate rescue became a journey of healing, one that would bind a broken man, a wild heart, and an entire town in ways nobody could predict. Before the story unfolds, let's make this community even closer. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe real love is about giving freedom, even when it hurts, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true stories that heal. The sky was barely beginning to pale when Rick Miller drove his old Chevy Silverado through the winding roads outside Asheville. The morning fog pressed in on all sides, thick as memory, swallowing the forest until the world narrowed to two silver headlights and the wet hiss of tires. Rick's hands, stiff from years of labor and loss, gripped the steering wheel. He liked this early hour. No voices, no expectations, just the ghostly music of radio static and the distant promise of sunrise. But today, even the quiet felt uneasy, restless, like something waiting in the woods. He slowed as the road dipped into a valley. Tree limbs arched overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast. His mind wandered, as it often did now, toward Maggie. Her laugh, the smell of coffee at dawn, the softness in her eyes when she told him to be careful, even after all those years. Grief, he'd learned, was a companion you never fully left behind. Sometimes it rode beside you, silent and heavy. Sometimes it sat in your lap, pressing tears from nowhere. A sudden movement, a flash of gold and gray, caught his eye to the left. Rick's heart jolted. He'd seen deer here before, even the occasional coyote, but this was different, wilder, desperate. Before he could react, something launched from the undergrowth and slammed hard against his truck. The open window on the passenger side exploded with a snarl and a blur of fur and claws. Instinct took over. Rick braked, tires shrieking, the truck skidding sideways on wet leaves. For a moment, time fractured. A wild animal, small but ferocious, eyes wide with panic, thrashed in the cab beside him, trailing blood across the dashboard. Rick's pulse hammered, fear wrestling with confusion. The creature was a bobcat, unmistakable even in chaos. Tufted ears, dappled coat, a tail little more than a stub. It yowled, twisting, trying to leap back out the window. But another shadow moved outside. A huge coyote, muzzle stained and eyes greedy, pacing the roadside. The bobcat, already bleeding from a wound on its shoulder, crouched low, pressed against the seat. Rick knew that look. Cornered, fighting to survive. Hey, easy," he muttered, voice cracking. He reached for his jacket, heart racing as he tried to shield the trembling animal, half expecting to be clawed to ribbons. But the bobcat only hissed, too exhausted for further fight. Outside, the coyote barked, then slunk away into the trees, its hunt foiled by glass and steel. Rick's hands shook as he pulled the truck onto the shoulder, hazards blinking. For a moment, man and animal stared at each other, both breathing hard. The cab stank of musk and fear. Then, in a flash of lightning through the fog, their eyes met, green gold and weary blue. In that single heartbeat, Rick felt something ancient and electric pass between them, a spark, a need. The bobcat's gaze was wild, terrified, but alive with a fierce will to endure. Rick's own loneliness, his aching sense of purposelessness, shifted inside him. Something was being called back to life. He didn't know what to do, only that he had to do something. Rick fumbled with a blanket from the back seat, talking in a low, steady murmur as if to soothe a frightened child. The bobcat watched, suspicious, but allowed him to drape the cloth over its shivering body. Blood oozed onto the faded plaid, but the cat's breathing slowed. Rick slid his phone from his jacket, hands unsteady, and snapped off a text to the nearest wildlife rehab. No signal. Of course. A car rounded the bend behind him, headlights slicing through the gloom. Rick's mind raced. What would they think, finding an old man on the roadside cradling a half-dead bobcat in his truck? He flashed the hazard lights, motioning them past. The driver stared, mouth open, then sped away. The story would get stranger before it got simpler. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder. Rick rolled up the windows, shivering as the cold seeped in. He'd never seen a wild animal this close, never felt the pulse of a heart so frantic, so desperate for another chance. Hang in there, buddy. You're safe now. Just breathe, he whispered, more to himself than the animal. His mind flashed back to years before, to Maggie's last winter. He remembered the nights spent beside her hospital bed, the soft beep of monitors, the stubborn hope that if he just stayed awake, just kept talking, she wouldn't slip away. That same resolve tightened his jaw now. He would not let this wild thing die alone. As dawn broke, the storm eased. Rick pressed the gas gently, turning the truck toward home. The bobcat, exhausted, curled tighter in the blanket, eyes tracking every move but no longer trying to escape. Rick drove slowly, one eye on the road, one on his trembling passenger. Something deep inside him, something that had withered with loss, began to stir again, raw and bright. He didn't know what the day would bring, only that for the first time in a long while, he had somewhere to go and someone who needed him. He spoke softly into the hush of the cab, as if making a promise. "Let's get you home, little one. We're not done fighting yet." Rick's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway as the first weak rays of sun struggled through the thinning fog. His modest house crouched at the edge of the woods, gray clapboard, sagging porch, and the kind of quiet that echoed. As he parked, he glanced at the bundle on the passenger seat. The young bobcat still trembled beneath the plaid blanket, fur matted with blood, wide eyes locked on Rick. It looked impossibly out of place in the world of humans, a wild spirit caught between freedom and fate. Rick paused, steeling himself for what came next. The practical side of him, the part raised on rules and consequences, warned this was crazy. Wild animals weren't pets. The law frowned on harboring anything not domestic, especially a predator. But the deeper, aching part of him, the part that had spent too many nights alone in the flickering blue glow of the TV, refused to let go. He popped open the door and called softly for Sally, his loyal old retriever. Sally emerged from the porch, tail wagging, nose twitching at the new scent in the air. She paused, sensing tension, and padded up beside Rick, eyes never leaving the truck. "All right, girl, we've got a guest," Rick whispered. Sally sat, ears perked, waiting for his lead. With infinite care, Rick bundled the bobcat in the blanket and carried it to the side door, heart hammering, senses alert for any sudden struggle. The animal hissed once, a desperate protest, but had no energy left to fight. Rick hurried inside, careful to keep the dog at his side, moving through the kitchen and down the hall to the laundry room, a small, windowless space with a heavy door. He set the bundle down in a cardboard box lined with old towels and closed the door behind him. The bobcat stared up, tense, breathing ragged, each movement a test of pain. Rick crouched down, keeping his body low and his voice gentle. Easy now. You're safe, I promise. He rummaged for his phone and tried the wildlife rehab number again. This time, a harried voice answered. Janice, the coordinator he'd spoken to a few times at local town halls. When he explained, her tone turned sharp with concern. Rick, you know you're not supposed to handle bobcats. They're dangerous, and it's illegal without a permit. I know, Janice, I know, Rick said, voice tight. But this one's just a kid, and she was half dead when she landed in my lap. I couldn't leave her out there. Janice sighed. Is it bleeding badly? Shoulders torn up. She's alert, but she's scared. I've got her safe in the laundry room. I can't send anyone until morning, with the roads this bad. Keep her warm, don't feed her. Just water if she'll take it. Keep the dog away. I'll check in at sunrise. Rick thanked her, relief and dread twining in his chest. He turned back to his wild charge. The bobcat, small but fierce, shrank deeper into the towels, eyes darting between Rick and Sally, who watched from the doorway, muscles tense but unmoving. Rick shut the door, giving the animal space. In the kitchen, he washed blood from his hands, the water swirling pink down the drain. Sally pressed her head against his knee, sensing the shift in the house, her loyalty unshaken by this new threat. Rick bent to stroke her head, murmuring, "Good girl. I know. It's not what we're used to." Outside, thunder rumbled low and heavy. The storm, teased by the morning, returned in earnest, rain pelting the windows. Rick brewed a pot of coffee and pulled an old camping chair into the hallway, planting himself outside the laundry room door. He could hear the soft rasp of claws on cardboard, the muffled whimper of the bobcat as she tried to hide from the world. The hours stretched. Rick tried reading, tried the TV, but his mind circled back to the battered animal in the next room. Images of Maggie filtered through his thoughts, her smile, her frailty at the end, how he'd sat up all night beside her, refusing to leave her alone in the dark. There was something familiar in this vigil, a fierce, stubborn refusal to abandon hope, even when hope was thin as fog. Once he heard a crash in the laundry room, a basket knocked over in panic. Rick cracked the door, careful to keep Sally back. The bobcat crouched in the farthest corner, eyes blazing, chest heaving. She looked ready to fight the world with her last breath. Rick spoke softly, letting the quiet carry his words. "It's okay. I know you're scared. Me too, sometimes." He set a shallow bowl of water nearby, slid it across the floor, and retreated, closing the door but leaving a crack so he could listen. Sally settled in beside him, her steady presence a balm against the storm's howl. As midnight bled into morning, Rick's eyes grew heavy. The rain hammered on, the wind shaking the old house. Every so often, he heard the bobcat's breathing change, a sigh, a restless shuffle, the softest mewl of pain. Rick stayed awake, propped against the door, coffee growing cold, heart thrumming with stubborn purpose. At some point he dozed, memories and reality weaving together, the hospital room, Maggie's hand in his. The cold certainty that all he could do was be present, offer comfort, refuse to turn away. When he startled awake, the storm was still raging. Sally lifted her head, eyes tired but watchful. Rick stood, stretched aching muscles, and opened the door a crack. The bobcat stared back, battered but alive. He saw it then, the tiny, trembling thread that connected them. Both of them, lost in a world they didn't choose, refusing to give up. Rick pulled up a stool and sat in the doorway, determined not to let the animal spend the night alone. "We'll get through this," he murmured, voice hoarse with hope. "We'll get through it together." And as the first uncertain light crept through the rain, Rick Miller, a man who'd lost almost everything, found himself keeping watch over a wild heart that refused to surrender. The house was shrouded in silence, save for the distant tick of the kitchen clock and the storm's lingering grumble beyond the windows. Rick Miller sat slouched on a worn stool in the narrow hallway, his back pressed against the laundry room door. The tension from the previous night lingered in his muscles, a gnawing ache that refused to ease. He flexed his fingers, recalling the wild flash in the Bobcat's eyes, half terror, half defiance. For the first time in years, he felt both the thrill and the burden of being needed. The old retriever, Sally, lay curled beside him, her steady breath a grounding rhythm in the hush. Occasionally she lifted her head, ears twitching toward the muffled sounds inside the laundry room. Rick reached down to scratch her ears, grateful for her patience. "We've been through worse, huh, girl? At least this time it's not just me talking to the walls." In the pale wash of dawn, Rick pushed himself to his feet and eased the laundry room door open a few cautious inches. The Bobcat, still a stranger, huddled at the far end of a cardboard box, her tawny body tense and coiled. Her wound looked angry. Dried blood crusted around the torn flesh at her shoulder, her breathing shallow but even. For a long moment, man and animal regarded each other in wary silence. Rick moved with careful deliberation, keeping his body low and his gestures slow. He spoke in a voice softer than he'd used in years, recalling the way he'd once soothed Maggie through the worst of her pain. "Hey there. I brought you some water. Just want to make you comfortable." The Bobcat, she needed a name, didn't she? Watched, muscles taut as wire, but didn't lunge or flinch when Rick slid the bowl closer. He sat cross-legged near the doorway, notebook in his lap, a habit Maggie had tried to coax him into long ago. He'd refused then, said he had nothing worth writing about. Now, with the house holding its breath and a wild creature clinging to life just feet away, the urge to put words to page felt necessary, like breathing. He began with awkward, stumbling sentences, fragments about fear, about the strange comfort of company, about his late wife's voice echoing in his mind. He wrote about the Bobcat's eyes, how they reflected every shadow in the room, how they burned with a stubborn will to survive. He wrote about the ache that never quite left him, the sense that he was drifting untethered since Maggie died. Each line was rough, uncertain, but it loosened something inside him, made the loneliness a shade less sharp. As the morning stretched on, Sally wandered in, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scent. She sat a cautious distance from the box, golden eyes flicking between Rick and the Bobcat. Juniper. Yes, that would be her name, he decided suddenly, after the tough, bright berries that survived the harshest Carolina winters. He whispered it aloud, letting the sound fill the cramped room. Juniper. The Bobcat's ears twitched at the word, her body tensing. Rick let the silence linger, then set about cleaning her wound with the supplies he'd gathered. Hydrogen peroxide, an old towel, trembling hands. Each time he reached close, Juniper hissed, but she didn't strike. Sally watched, holding herself utterly still, a silent sentinel. It was slow, delicate work. Rick apologized with every gentle touch. "I know it hurts. I know. I'm just trying to help." He recalled with a pang the nights spent tending Maggie's bruised arms, how her strength faded, but her spirit never did. The Bobcat's wildness reminded him of that, untamable, determined. Eventually, Juniper let her head rest on her paws, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Rick sat back, wiping sweat from his brow, and met Sally's steady gaze. The dog inched closer, settling just outside the bobcat's reach. The air felt charged with possibility. 3 unlikely companions, each holding a piece of sorrow and hope. Rick picked up his notebook again, the words flowing easier now. There's more to saving something than patching up wounds. Sometimes it's just about being there, about sharing the quiet when the world feels too loud, about listening, even when nobody's sure how to ask for help. He wrote until his hand cramped, pouring years of silence onto the page. In the background, Juniper stirred, blinking drowsily, her breathing deep and even. Rick realized with a jolt that the tension in his chest had loosened. A thread of warmth, fragile but real, winding through the cold space where loneliness had lived. He decided to stay in the laundry room for a while, just to make sure Juniper didn't take a turn for the worse. Sally dozed by the door, content to share her master's vigil. Rick hummed an old tune under his breath, the melody weaving between them like a spell. In the quiet, Rick's mind drifted to the world outside, neighbors who'd grown distant, days spent wandering grocery aisles just to hear another voice. He realized he hadn't felt this connected to anything in years. He was tired, yes, and afraid for Juniper, but he was alive with the urgency of care, of purpose. At midday, Juniper shifted, stretching her front legs with a soft grunt. Her tail twitched. Rick smiled, feeling a ridiculous surge of pride at such a small, wild gesture. "You're a fighter, Juniper," he whispered. Sally thumped her tail in approval. As shadows lengthened, the room grew warmer. Juniper accepted a few sips of water, then rested her head again, her eyes never leaving Rick's. For the first time since the accident, she let him stroke her fur, just once, just for a second, before pulling away. But that moment, fragile and electric, felt like a promise. Rick returned to his journal, writing about hope, about how it sometimes came disguised as trouble, about the wild things that entered your life and refused to leave you unchanged. The words flowed, filling pages he hadn't known were empty. Evening crept in, the sky darkening to indigo. Sally curled close, Juniper's breathing slow and steady, Rick's pen scratching in the hush. In that quiet, something shifted. The loneliness, once a solid wall, grew porous. Through its cracks, the warmth of new connection, shy, bruised but unmistakable, began to filter in. Rick closed his notebook and watched Juniper sleep. He understood now that healing wasn't only for the injured or the wild. It was for the broken places in himself, too. And as the night settled over the house, Rick, Sally, and Juniper faced the dark. Not as strangers, but as unlikely company. Each finding their own small measure of hope in the presence of the others. The days that followed blurred together in a gentle, uncertain rhythm, each one a little different, but stitched together by the constant presence of hope and caution. The storm finally passed, leaving the woods washed clean and sparkling in the sharp winter light. Rick Miller found himself caught up in a quiet he hadn't known in years, one filled not with emptiness, but with purpose. Rick spent his mornings hunched over the kitchen table, laptop open, reading articles and forums about wildlife rescue. He scribbled notes in a spiral-bound notebook, filling pages with dietary needs, warning signs, and methods for keeping a wild bobcat healthy without breaking its spirit. He called Janice at the rehab center every day, updating her on Juniper's condition, and listening carefully to her advice. "So, you're doing good work, Rick," Janice said one morning. "But remember, Juniper needs to stay wild if she's going to survive out there. Don't let her get too comfortable with people. That's the hardest part for most folks." Rick nodded, even though she couldn't see. He understood, but it was harder in practice. Every time he brought Juniper her meal, a mix of raw chicken, water, and supplements, she watched him with those unblinking wild eyes, alert for any sign of threat. At first, she refused to eat unless he left the room. Over time, as her wound began to knit together and her strength returned, she grew bolder, venturing to the edge of her box, her movements quick and wary. Sally, too, adapted to the new order of things. The old retriever gave Juniper plenty of space, only occasionally sticking her nose around the laundry room door to check on the Bobcat's progress. There were moments of tension. Once, Juniper bared her teeth, a rumble in her chest. But Sally responded with calm patience, lying down and waiting until the Bobcat looked away. In her own quiet way, Sally was teaching Juniper about trust, about living alongside others without fear. Afternoons often found Rick in the living room, reading aloud from one of Maggie's old books, his voice slow and steady as he shared stories of adventure and loss. Sometimes, when the sun was bright, he moved Juniper's box into the warm patch of light by the window. Sally would settle nearby, and for a while the three of them would doze in the silence, the air thick with the scent of pine and dust motes swirling in the golden beams. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Rick noticed something remarkable. Juniper, her eyes half closed in the sunlight, let out a low, contented purr, a sound Rick had only ever heard from house cats, never anything so wild. The sound tugged at something deep in him, a reminder that even wounded things could find peace, if only for a moment. But there were challenges, too. Some nights Juniper would pace restlessly, scraping her claws against the door, yowling into the dark. Rick worried she might never be satisfied indoors, that her wildness would turn to frustration or fear. He called Janice, describing the behavior. "She's healing, Rick. That's her nature calling," Janice said. "You're doing right by her, but she's not meant to stay caged. When the vet clears her, she'll need an outdoor space to start learning the world again." Rick felt a pang of dread at the thought, of preparing to say goodbye before he'd really had a chance to know her. But he understood. Real love, he was learning, meant giving someone the freedom to leave. One evening, 2 weeks after the rescue, a white pickup from the Fish and Wildlife Department crunched up Rick's drive. 2 officers, one young and brisk, the other older and watchful, came to check on Juniper and assess Rick's setup. "Mr. Miller, it's a noble thing you've done," said the senior officer, peering into the laundry room as Juniper hissed from her corner. "But this cat needs to stay wild. No petting, no treats. You're just the bridge back to the woods." Rick bristled at their tone, pride mingling with worry. "I know that. She's not tame. She's just healing." The younger officer knelt by the box, clipboard in hand. "We'll need her to be released as soon as the vet signs off. Until then, minimize human contact. We can help build a transition enclosure outside if you want." Rick agreed, though his heart twisted at the idea of moving Juniper out of the warmth and safety they'd built together. After the officers left, he sat on the porch steps, Sally pressed against his side. The woods loomed dark and mysterious, full of promise and threat. Rick found himself talking quietly to the empty yard, as if Juniper could hear him. "I want to help you, but I can't keep you. That's the hardest thing, kid. Loving something enough to let it go." Days passed, marked by small victories and setbacks, Juniper's fur grew glossy again, her limp fading. Sally became a quiet companion in the sunlit afternoons, sharing the warmth without encroaching on the bobcat's space. Rick found himself laughing more, writing more, even humming old songs as he cooked meals or cleaned the house. He began to see the parallels. Juniper's slow, cautious recovery mirrored his own. The pain of loss hadn't vanished, but it dulled a little every time Juniper ate a full meal, every time she curled up in the sunlight instead of the shadows. Healing, Rick realized, wasn't just for the body, it was for the spirit too. But the warnings of the officers stayed with him. Juniper needed to stay wild. Every time she let Rick get too close, he gently reminded himself to pull back, to let her keep her space. He understood now that real care wasn't about holding on tight, but about preparing for the moment you had to say goodbye. One evening, as the sun set and the sky burned orange behind the trees, Rick sat with his journal, Sally at his feet, and Juniper drowsing in the last light. He wrote, "Some gifts aren't meant to be kept. Some are just meant to pass through, reminding us what it means to be brave, to care, to let go. Maybe that's what living is in the end. A string of small kindnesses, a willingness to heal and be healed, even if only for a little while." The house was no longer just a quiet refuge for an old man and his dog. It had become a place of transition, a sanctuary for healing, for remembering, and for learning the hardest lesson of all: to love enough to let go. Rumors had a way of moving through small towns like wind through winter branches, swift, insistent, impossible to ignore. Rick didn't think much of it at first, but soon he realized the world beyond his windows was changing. It started with the neighbor across the road, Miss Edna, who walked her beagle past Rick's mailbox every morning. One cold Thursday she paused, squinting at the house. "Heard you got yourself a new roommate, Rick," she called, her voice crackling with a mix of worry and curiosity. Before Rick could reply, her phone was up, snapping a photo of the muddy paw prints beneath his kitchen window. She laughed, shaking her head, and moved on, but by sunset that image had traveled further than Rick would have believed. It wasn't long before the local Facebook group was buzzing about Rick Miller and his wildcat. At first, the attention felt like a nuisance, just another reminder that privacy was hard to hold on to in Asheville, no matter how far you lived from Main Street. But then something shifted. Instead of fear or outrage, many in the community reached out with genuine concern and kindness. Baskets of food arrived on Rick's porch. One morning, a note was taped to his front door, written in a child's careful scrawl. "Dear Mr. Rick, is the bobcat getting better? I hope she feels brave." Curiosity bloomed. Cars slowed on the gravel road, and neighborhood kids peered through the fence, hoping for a glimpse of Juniper sunning herself on the porch steps. Rick found himself fielding questions from strangers at the grocery store. "Is it true she purrs when you read to her? Ain't you scared she'll turn on you? Can my daughter draw her for her science project?" The attention was sometimes overwhelming, but it warmed Rick too. For the first time in a long while, people saw him, not just as the old widower at the end of the lane, but as someone doing something brave and meaningful. Then came Mrs. Coleman, a fifth-grade teacher from the local elementary school, who called Rick one evening, her voice bright with excitement. "We'd love to make Juniper's story a class project, Mr. Miller, about wildlife, caring for our neighbors, all that good stuff. The kids are obsessed. Maybe you could send us updates, or let us visit safely, of course." Rick hesitated, then agreed. It felt good, sharing Juniper's recovery, helping kids learn about wild things and the fragile lines between care and captivity. He wrote weekly letters to Mrs. Coleman's class, describing Juniper's progress, her love of sunbeams, her wary eyes, her slow but steady healing. The students sent back drawings, bobcats leaping, sleeping, sometimes even wearing a superhero cape. Rick hung them on the fridge, pride and anxiety mingling in his chest. Of course, not everyone approved. Some folks in town, especially the older, more cautious ones, grumbled about public safety and the risk of keeping a wild animal so close to people. A few made anonymous calls to animal control, and Rick found himself explaining, again and again, that Juniper was only a temporary guest, a rescue on her way back to the wild. The local wildlife authorities visited more frequently now, arriving with clipboards and stern expressions. They watched as Rick tended to Juniper, inspecting her living space and her wound, now nearly healed. "You're doing a fine job," one officer admitted grudgingly, "but don't let this animal get too used to people. That's the biggest danger for her now. She needs to remember how to be wild." Rick nodded, swallowing the urge to defend the gentle moments he'd shared with Juniper, the purrs, the brief trust in her eyes. He understood what was at stake, even if it hurt. Juniper's survival would depend on her fear of humans, on her instincts, not her affection. With the town's curiosity growing and the officials pressing him to prepare for Juniper's return to the wild, Rick knew it was time to build her a proper outdoor enclosure. He couldn't do it alone, not with his bad knees and the winter coming on hard. So he did something that surprised even himself. He asked for help. The response was immediate. Neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers showed up on a chilly Saturday morning with lumber, wire mesh, and thermoses of coffee. The work was messy and full of laughter. Kids hammered nails crookedly, fathers measured and remeasured, and old friends reminisced about the days when Rick and Maggie hosted summer cookouts in this very yard. Sally, the retriever, supervised, wagging her tail and greeting everyone who arrived. Juniper watched from the safety of her box inside the house, golden eyes unblinking, her tail flicking with every new sound. When the last screw was tightened, Rick stood back, his breath misting in the cold air, and admired the sturdy new enclosure. A miniature forest built from cedar branches, logs, and a shelter at the far end. He let Juniper explore the new space for the first time that afternoon. She moved with caution at first, sniffing the edges, her ears swiveling at every gust of wind. But soon she climbed the highest branch, tail high, and let out a fierce, echoing yowl, a call that sent chills down Rick's spine and made every helper in the yard stop and stare in awe. After the crowd left and the sun dipped low, Rick sat on the porch steps, watching Juniper prowl her new domain. He felt a bittersweet mix of relief and loss. He'd helped give her another chance, but every step she took away from him was a reminder that the time for goodbye was coming. Still, as Sally leaned against him and the kids' drawings fluttered on the refrigerator door, Rick understood something new. Even if Juniper's wild heart would soon carry her back into the unknown, the connections she'd forged, with Rick, with Sally, with the town, would linger, changing them all in small, important ways. That night, Rick wrote to Mrs. Coleman's class. "Juniper's eyes are the color of winter twilight, full of wildness and hope and something fierce that won't be tamed. She's almost ready for the woods. I think maybe I am too." The first true snap of winter came with a hard frost that etched every surface in silver. Rick woke before dawn to the creak of the old radiator, pulled on his thickest flannel, and shuffled to the kitchen window. Outside, His backyard glowed beneath a faint moon, ice crystals glittering on the new enclosure like a dusting of stars. In the hush, it was hard to imagine anything wild or dangerous could survive in such stillness. But Juniper did. She thrived. It had been 2 weeks since Rick, with the help of his neighbors, moved Juniper into her outdoor enclosure. The change was stark. Gone was the skittish, battered creature who'd cowered in a cardboard box. In her place was a bobcat transformed, muscular, alert, almost regal in the way she moved. She scaled the stacked logs with ease, vanished behind clumps of brush, then reappeared on the highest branch, tail flicking, amber eyes gleaming with mischief and challenge. Rick watched every morning, his heart swelling and breaking at once. Sometimes, he'd catch Juniper watching the woods beyond the wire, ears pricked to the sounds of distant birds or the snap of a twig. Her world was expanding, and with it, so was the space between her and Rick. He adapted his routines, visiting the enclosure only when necessary. He left food and water at the far end, rarely lingering. The first few days, Juniper shadowed him, her curiosity outweighing her caution. But as the days grew colder and her wounds fully healed, she kept her distance, disappearing into her den or darting into the underbrush before he arrived. Sally, too, felt the change. The old retriever took up her post by the fence, lying in a patch of sun or shadow, sometimes watching Juniper and sometimes simply napping, her trust as steady as ever. Occasionally, Juniper crept closer, nose twitching at the familiar scent of dog and man, but she never crossed the invisible line that marked safety from surrender. One afternoon, as the sky bruised with storm clouds, Rick tried calling to Juniper as he once had, soft, coaxing, hopeful. The bobcat appeared, her coat thick and glossy, but she only watched him, head tilted, before slipping silently away. Rick stood in the chill, the ache in his chest sharp and familiar. He remembered what the wildlife officers had warned. The best gift he could give Juniper was freedom, not comfort. Wildness was her shield, her only real hope. That evening, Rick journaled by the fire, Sally curled at his feet. The house felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but a threshold. He wrote about change, about how love sometimes looked like letting someone become a stranger again. He wrote about Maggie, about the way she'd slipped further from him in her last days, not out of choice, but out of necessity. He remembered sitting at her bedside, telling her stories even when she no longer replied, holding her hand through the silence. "Juniper is leaving me, just as the world always does," he wrote, his pen trembling. But maybe that's the point. We're meant to let go. We're meant to hurt and hope all at once. The next days brought new challenges. A squirrel found its way into the enclosure, setting off a wild chase that left fur and feathers scattered, but no real harm done. Juniper's hunting instincts sharpened, her movements quick and sure. Sometimes Rick watched her from the kitchen window, marveling at how little she resembled the trembling animal he'd first rescued. He began to understand. This was what she was meant to be. Still, not every moment was triumph. One night, a neighbor's cat strayed too close to the enclosure, yowling at Juniper from the other side of the fence. Rick hurried outside, heart pounding, and managed to scare the house cat away before things turned bloody. He stayed up late repairing a small tear in the mesh, worry and guilt gnawing at him. In town, people still asked after Juniper. Some children left handmade signs by Rick's mailbox. "Good luck, Wildcat. Stay brave, Juniper." Their faith in her made Rick smile, but it was a reminder of the new story he'd become a part of, one that belonged to the whole community now. not just to him. The wildlife officers returned for another inspection, this time with less suspicion and more respect. They watched Juniper stalk the length of the enclosure, muscles bunching beneath her fur, tail twitching, every inch a creature of the wild. "She's looking good, Rick," the senior officer said, nodding. "You've done right by her. Not everyone could have let her go like this." Rick swallowed, pride and pain mingling. "It's not easy. Feels like every day I lose a little more of her." The officer clapped his shoulder. "That means you did it right." After they left, Rick sat on the porch, Sally's head in his lap, watching dusk settle over the woods. Juniper leapt onto her favorite branch, silhouetted against the fading light. For a long time she watched the forest, nose twitching at the scents carried on the wind, then looked back at Rick, just for a moment, before turning away. That night, Rick wrote in his journal, "She's almost ready. I'm not sure I am. Maybe I never will be, but I see it now. Her wildness is her hope. The truest act of love I have left is to let her answer it." As winter deepened, Juniper's independence grew. Some mornings, Rick found her prints in the frost, leading from one end of the enclosure to the other, restless, searching. Sometimes, she ignored his presence altogether, lost in her own wild world. The connection between them changed, no longer a thread of need, but a current of respect, quiet and unspoken. Rick missed the days when Juniper sought his company, missed the fragile trust in her eyes. But every milestone, every kill, every leap, every cold night survived was both a victory and a heartbreak. He learned in those silent weeks that healing could never mean ownership. It could only mean giving what was needed, then stepping aside. Each act of care, every meal, every cautious step back was a promise kept, not a chain fastened. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Rick closed his journal and listened to the quiet house, Sally's breathing the only sound. He thought of Maggie, of Juniper, of every goodbye he'd ever survived. He let himself believe for a moment that love's real power was in helping another become who they were meant to be, even if it meant letting them go. And in that hard, beautiful lesson, Rick found a strange kind of peace, one that echoed in the wind, the woods, and the winter eyes of a wildcat named Juniper. The winter came down hard that year, a sudden blizzard smothering Asheville in white. Rick woke to a world transformed, fences and fields vanishing beneath snowdrifts. The trees bowed under the weight of ice. The old house creaked and groaned in the wind. Rick shuffled to the window, rubbing frost from the glass. His first thought, as always now, was Juniper. The yard was unrecognizable, the usual landmarks erased by swirling snow. Rick grabbed his coat and boots, bundled up, and hurried out with Sally. The retriever, usually slow to leave the warmth, pressed close, sensing Rick's unease. The air stung his face and stilled his breath, the cold sharp as broken glass. When he reached the enclosure, Rick's heart jolted. The outer gate hung open, wind snapping the latch against the fence. Inside, Juniper was nowhere to be seen. Only a trail of prints, sharp, determined, led out through the open gate and vanished into the storm. "Sally!" Rick called, voice tight with panic. The dog whined, nose to the ground, already tracking the path through the deepening snow. Rick fumbled with the broken latch, guilt and fear burning in his chest. How had he missed it? Had he forgotten to check the lock? Or had the wind simply forced it open? He scanned the horizon, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Juniper lost, starving, freezing, easy prey for hunger, for fear, for man. He followed Sally across the yard, his boots sinking in the drifts. The storm closed in, thick and blinding. He shouted Juniper's name, voice lost to the wind. Trees loomed out of the white, shadows shifting. He remembered all the nights by Maggie's bedside, helpless to do anything but hope, and felt that old, raw terror clawing at his heart. Sally barked suddenly and took off toward the far fence. Rick stumbled after her, snow numbing his hands and feet. At the edge of the woods, he saw a patch of blood on the snow, just a smear, a flash of red against white. His pulse roared in his ears. "Sally, find her!" Rick choked out, desperation tightening his throat. He crashed through a thicket, branches tearing at his sleeves, following the dog's bay. The woods were silent, save for the scream of the wind and the frantic beat of Rick's heart. He slipped, fell, got up, pushing deeper into the dark, cold wild. Suddenly, Sally stopped and began barking wildly. Rick hurried to her side and saw Juniper, caught, tangled in a patch of barbed wire near the old fence line, her flank heaving with exhaustion, her fur dusted with snow and streaked with fresh blood. She'd tried to leap the fence, but her back leg was caught tight. She struggled, wild-eyed, snarling with terror and pain. Rick's heart nearly broke at the sight. He knelt in the snow, fingers numb, voice trembling. "Easy, girl. I'm here. I've got you, Juniper. I'm not leaving." Sally circled, whining, pressing her muzzle to Rick's side. The cold bit deep as Rick fumbled with the wire, careful not to startle Juniper into worse injury. Each time he moved, she lashed out, teeth flashing, claws slicing the air. Blood welled from a gash on Rick's wrist, but he didn't stop. He spoke softly, repeating Maggie's old words, words meant to comfort the dying, now spoken to the wild. "You're safe, sweetheart. You're not alone. Just a little longer." It felt like hours, his hands shaking, sweat freezing on his brow, but finally he freed Juniper's leg. She tumbled to the ground, too weak to run, her chest shuddering with every breath. Rick wrapped her in his jacket, heedless of the claws, and lifted her in his arms. She was lighter than he remembered, but solid, alive. The walk home was agony. Rick's boots slipped, his body screamed for rest, but he held Juniper tight, Sally plowing a path through the storm. By the time he stumbled onto the porch, his whole world had narrowed to the weight in his arms and the hope that it wasn't too late. Inside, he laid Juniper by the fire, Sally standing guard. He cleaned her wounds, his own hands raw and bleeding, working by the flicker of candlelight as the power sputtered and died. Juniper's eyes fluttered open, wild but aware, and for a moment, she didn't flinch when Rick's hand brushed her fur. She was too tired for fear now, too close to the edge to do anything but trust. Rick sat with her all night, whispering stories, singing fragments of old songs, refusing to close his eyes. He pressed his hand to her side, feeling the fragile thump of her heart, willing her to survive. Sally dozed at his feet, every so often lifting her head to check on the wildcat she'd come to accept as part of the pack. The storm raged, but inside, something fierce and tender held them together. Three creatures, battered by loss, refusing to surrender. At dawn, Juniper lifted her head, eyes clear and fierce. She struggled upright, testing her injured leg, and let out a low, determined growl. Rick smiled through tears, pride, and heartbreak blending in his chest. "That's it, Juniper. Show the world you're not done yet." A few hours later, the wildlife officers arrived. having braved the snowy roads. Rick recounted the night's ordeal, showing them the wound on Juniper's leg and the new scars on his own. They nodded with approval and concern, but what mattered most was their final verdict. Juniper, after all she'd survived, was ready. "She's strong. She's wild. She knows how to fight for her life," the senior officer said. "When spring comes, she'll be ready to return to the woods." As Rick watched Juniper settle by the window, her eyes on the thawing world outside, he knew the ordeal had changed them both. The blizzard had tested their limits, but it had also proven something essential. Juniper's wildness was not just her challenge, but her greatest strength. And Rick, once again, learned that the hardest rescue was not saving a life, but preparing his heart to let that life go free. Spring arrived in Asheville as a soft promise. Green shoots thrusting up through the old snow, birds returning with song, and the air full of the scent of rain and rebirth. Rick Miller stood on his porch, one hand resting on Sally's head, and watched the world come alive after the long, punishing winter. The months since the blizzard had been slow and patient. Every day Juniper grew stronger. Her limp faded. Her fur glowed in the sun, and her wild eyes burned brighter than ever. There was a new tension in the air, both hopeful and sorrowful. Rick felt it each morning when he brought Juniper her food and water. Less often now, and always placed at the far end of the enclosure as instructed. The bobcat moved like a shadow, quick and silent, sometimes barely glancing in Rick's direction. It was a good sign, the wildlife officers told him. She was readying herself for freedom. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the day. Mrs. Coleman's fifth graders sent a stack of letters and drawings, each one wishing Juniper good luck. Neighbors called to ask when she'd be released, and some even offered to help. Rick was touched by the community's affection, but deep down, he knew this moment belonged to Juniper and to him alone. A promise kept, a journey nearly complete. The wildlife officers arrived on a warm Saturday morning, their faces serious but kind. They checked Juniper's enclosure, watched her move, tested the old wound on her leg, and nodded in approval. "She's ready, Rick," the senior officer said. "Let's give her the send-off she deserves." Word spread fast, and by noon a quiet crowd had gathered beyond the fence. Neighbors, families, and nearly a dozen local children, standing with their teachers. Some held handmade signs, "Run free, Juniper," while others simply watched with wide eyes, their excitement tempered by the hush of something sacred. Rick walked to the enclosure with Sally at his side, his heart hammering in his chest. The past year flickered through his mind. The chaos of that first dawn, the frantic rescue in the snow, the late nights spent keeping vigil. It all led to this. He looked down at Sally, who wagged her tail but seemed to sense the moment's gravity. He knelt beside the gate, taking a shaky breath. "This is it, girl," he whispered, speaking more to himself than to the dog. He slid the latch open, then stepped back, giving Juniper space. Inside the enclosure, the bobcat hesitated. She paced the length of the fence, muscles tense, eyes darting from Rick to the open gate and back again. The crowd held its collective breath. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Juniper paused at the threshold, one paw hovering above the earth, nose twitching at the scents of spring, mud, new grass, the distant trace of other wild things. She looked back at Rick, her eyes unreadable. It was a glance filled with everything unsaid. Gratitude, caution, a flash of the old fear. But above all, the knowledge that their time together had run its course. Rick felt tears sting his eyes, but he smiled through them, nodding his encouragement. "Go on, Juniper," he whispered, voice catching. "It's your world now." With a final glance at Sally, who stood like a sentry beside her master, Juniper slipped through the gate, one fluid motion, as if she'd always known how to leave. She padded into the grass, then paused just beyond the fence line, turning to face the people who had gathered to witness her return. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. Then Juniper lifted her head, let out a wild, triumphant yowl, and vanished into the green shadows of the trees. A collective sigh rose from the crowd. Some clapped quietly, others wiped their eyes, and the children bounced in place, pointing after the bobcat's disappearing form. Rick stayed by the open gate long after the others drifted away. The sun rose higher, birds flitted through the branches, and for the first time in a long while, he felt both emptied and full. Sally leaned against his knee, offering silent comfort. He knelt in the soft earth, brushing his hand over the grass where Juniper's prints still lingered. In that touch, he felt everything: loss, pride, relief, and a strange, radiant gratitude. He had kept his promise. He had been there when Juniper needed him, and he had the courage to let her go when she needed to be wild. Later that evening, as twilight painted the yard in lavender and gold, Rick sat on his porch steps with Sally, watching the tree line. The neighbors were gone, the kids' voices only echoes in the warm air. The world felt quieter, changed by what it had witnessed. In the hush, Rick found himself speaking softly, as if Juniper could hear him wherever she roamed. "Thank you for letting me be part of your story," he said, voice gentle and strong. "Thank you for teaching me to hope again. Run wild, Juniper. Don't look back." Sally nuzzled his hand, her warmth a steady presence at his side. Rick closed his eyes, letting the night settle around him. He realized that just like Juniper, he too had been set free, released from the weight of grief, the cage of loneliness, the old fear that nothing new could ever begin. The town, small and close-knit, remembered the day for a long time. Mrs. Coleman's class planted a young sapling in the schoolyard in Juniper's honor, a living reminder of courage, kindness, and the wild hearts within us all. The children told and retold the story, and for weeks after, every shadow in the woods seemed to hold the promise of Juniper's return. Rick never forgot that moment at the gate, the space between holding on and letting go, the hush before freedom. He carried it with him, a silent gift, proof that every act of love changes the world, and sometimes, if you're brave enough, it sets both the giver and the receiver free. The weeks after Juniper's release moved with the easy, steady rhythm of spring. For the first time in years, Rick Miller woke each day not with the ache of loneliness, but with a gentle curiosity about what the morning might bring. He tended his small garden, walked Sally along the green edges of the woods, and sometimes found himself standing by the open gate where Juniper had vanished, his heart full of memories and questions. At first, the emptiness stung. Every time Rick saw the sunlit patch where Juniper once stretched or heard a branch snap in the brush, he'd look up expecting to see her golden eyes peering back. But the enclosure stayed empty, and the wild yard was quiet except for birdsong and the hum of bees. It was a different kind of quiet now, not hollow, but peaceful, as if the land itself was resting after a long vigil. The community, too, seemed changed by Juniper's story. People stopped Rick in town to ask for news or share their own small tales of wild things. A hawk rescued from fishing line, a possum found sleeping in a garage, a deer sighted at dusk. The sapling Mrs. Coleman's class had planted in the schoolyard took root and flourished. Every child who passed touched its slender trunk, whispering hopes for Juniper, for themselves, for the future. In a world that too often turned inward, Juniper's journey had reminded everyone of the ties that bound them, to each other, and to the wild things living just beyond the edge of the known. As the weeks slipped by, Rick found himself growing quieter inside. His hair had thinned and silvered, his steps had slowed, and Sally, too, seemed to feel the weight of time. But there was contentment now, a sense of having done something right, something good. He spent long evenings on the porch with Sally, reading or just watching the sun drift low, the sky painted in gold and rose. It was during one of these evenings, as the sun balanced on the horizon and the world held its breath in that golden hour before dusk, that Rick saw movement at the edge of the trees. At first he thought it was a trick of light, a shifting shadow, a memory come to life. But Sally sat up, ears pricked, nose twitching at a familiar scent. There she was, Juniper. She lingered in the dappled light, larger now, her coat thick and glossy, her muscles rippling with health. She was unmistakably wild, the old wariness in her stance, but there was recognition in her eyes, a flash of gold meeting blue across the quiet yard. For a long, breathless moment, she stood there, neither approaching nor running, just watching. Rick's heart leapt. He rose slowly, not wanting to startle her. Sally sat, tail thumping softly, her gaze fixed on the bobcat who had once shared her home. Rick did not call Juniper's name. He didn't move closer. He simply stood in the hush, letting the air between them fill with all the things they could not say. Juniper looked back at the house, at Sally, at Rick. Then she gave a single, silent nod of her head, the gesture so subtle Rick might have imagined it. After a heartbeat, she turned and melted back into the woods, her form vanishing among the shadows and sunbeams. Rick stood rooted in place, his chest aching with a bittersweet joy. He felt as if a circle had closed, a promise honored, a life set free returning just long enough to say thank you, to show that all their efforts, all their pain and hope, had mattered. As the last light faded, Rick sat on the porch steps and let Sally lean into his side. He thought of Maggie, her final words, the touch of her hand, her quiet faith that nothing loved was ever truly lost. He thought of the ache that had filled his heart for so long, now gentled by the bond he'd formed with a wild creature. In that golden hour, everything seemed connected, the living and the gone, the wild and the tame, the sorrow and the joy. Rick pulled his old journal from his pocket and wrote by the fading light, "We do not save wild things. Not really. We are simply invited into their world for a little while, asked to risk our hearts, and then asked to let them go. What you give returns in its own way, sometimes as a memory, sometimes as a lesson, sometimes as a fleeting glimpse at sunset. The truest bonds are made not of possession, but of trust, respect, and the courage to face loss and change." He paused, listening to the soft rustle of the leaves and the gentle huff of Sally's breath. He felt the fullness of everything, of what it meant to love and let go, to trust that the gifts you gave the world would echo on long after you were gone. As twilight deepened, Rick felt Maggie's presence settle over him like a blessing. He remembered her faith in hope, her belief in kindness, her insistence that the world could always be remade by a single good deed. He understood now, with a clarity born of hardship and grace, that the story he'd shared with Juniper, and with his community, would outlast him. The porch light flickered on, moths spinning in its glow, and Rick closed his journal, content in the hush of the coming night. Somewhere out in the dark, Juniper ran wild and free, and Rick knew, deep down, that nothing loved is ever lost. Not really. It always finds its way home, in its own wild and wondrous fashion. Years passed in Asheville, marked by the slow growth of trees and the steady rhythm of seasons. The story of Rick Miller and the wild bobcat named Juniper lingered long after the paw prints faded from the yard. It was told in classrooms, whispered on front porches, and woven into the fabric of the town's small joys and quiet sorrows. Rick's home, once just a weathered cottage at the edge of the woods, became a kind of landmark. Children from Mrs. Coleman's class would visit each spring, running up the walk, eager to see the place where wildness and kindness had crossed paths. They came to water the sapling they'd planted for Juniper, now grown strong and leafy, its roots tangled deep in the rich Carolina soil. For them, the old man's porch was a bridge to the world beyond, where animals roamed free and hearts were tested by love and letting go. Rick himself moved more slowly as the years turned, his hair gone nearly white, his steps careful. Sally, his loyal companion, had grown gray around the muzzle and preferred the warmth of the sun to long walks. Yet the old dog still perked up when children arrived, trotting alongside them as they listened to Rick's gentle stories. A plaque appeared in Rick's yard, set at the base of Juniper's tree. For those who love enough to let go. The community had voted on the words. Rick didn't object. He only smiled, remembering the day Juniper slipped into the woods and the bittersweet freedom that followed. He'd never tried to claim credit or heroism. "I was just in the right place," he'd say, waving away praise. It was Juniper who did all the fighting. Sometimes, on warm evenings, Rick would sit on his porch and listen to the rustle of the woods. Neighbors might spot a flash of golden fur at the tree line. Quick, cautious, never close. "There she is," the children would whisper, eyes wide with wonder. Whether it was truly Juniper or just wishful thinking, no one could say for certain. What mattered was the hope she inspired, the wild possibility that love, given freely, always returned in some form. The story grew, as stories do. High schoolers used it for essays on compassion. Local artists painted murals of Juniper leaping through green shadows. The town's annual fair added a new event. Juniper's Dash, a children's race that ended beneath the wildcat's tree, with ribbons for every runner. It became a tradition to tell the tale at sunset, when the golden light bathed the hills and the air was thick with memory. One day, a teacher brought her students to visit. She asked Rick to share what he'd learned, not just about bobcats, but about life. Rick looked at the eager faces, at Sally curled beside him, and at the sturdy tree overhead. He cleared his throat, voice soft but certain. "I think the wild teaches us about courage and about humility," he said. "About how real care isn't holding tight, but helping others find their place, even if that means watching them go. You can't force wildness into your world. You have to meet it where it lives, respect it, and be brave enough to let it leave when the time comes." A boy raised his hand. "Wasn't it sad to say goodbye?" Rick smiled, the lines in his face deepening. "Yes, it was, but it would have been sadder if I'd tried to keep her. Sometimes, the best kind of love is the kind that makes you let go, even when your heart wants to hold on forever." A hush fell as the children absorbed this. Some would carry the lesson for a lifetime. Others would forget until life tested them in its own way. But the seeds were planted, like Juniper's tree, growing taller with each passing year. News of Rick's story reached further than he ever expected. A magazine wrote about the town's unusual friendship with a wild bobcat. Visitors came asking quiet questions, taking pictures of the tree and the plaque. But for Rick, the fame meant little. What mattered was the quiet pride he felt when he watched children playing beneath the branches, or when he saw a wild animal pass at dusk and felt no fear, only gratitude for having been a small part of its journey. Sally passed away one autumn, curled up on the porch she'd guarded so long. Rick buried her beneath the tree, beside a stone etched with her name and a paw print. That winter, as snow fell gently on the yard, Rick sat alone on the steps, wrapped in a quilt, his heart heavy with loss, but not with regret. He spoke aloud, his voice drifting into the woods. "Thank you, old friend, and thank you, Juniper, wherever you are." In time, Rick grew frailer. Neighbors brought him soup, children raked his leaves, and every spring the school sent a new batch of letters and drawings. The tree flourished, sheltering birds and squirrels, its roots spreading wider each year. Juniper herself was seen less often, but sometimes, at the golden hour, Rick would catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of the world, wild, free, and whole. The legend of Juniper and the old man at the edge of the woods became something more than a tale. It became a part of how the community understood itself, a reminder that the boundaries between species, solitude, and society could be crossed by a single act of kindness. The children, now grown, told the story to their own children, who planted new trees in Juniper's honor. On his last spring, Rick sat beneath the tree as the sun went down. He closed his eyes and listened to the wild, felt the gentle press of Sally's spirit, the distant call of Juniper, the laughter of children in the yard. In his final journal entry, he wrote, "To love deeply is to set free. True kinship isn't about holding on, but about helping others find their place in the world, wild, whole, and unafraid. If you risk caring, you'll find the greatest gifts where you least expect them." And with that, Rick slipped into sleep, his story woven forever into the wild heart of Asheville.